Canvas Church. Welcome back to welcome back to our first step in meeting back together. And so let me tell you, we haven't been in this room for a long time, and so obviously some new things in place, some new protocols for at least the time being that we just got to respect as we take those little steps forward. But excited to gather back together again. For those who are watching on the live stream, our live stream stuff all went wonky when we were trying to set it up, and so we're improvising, so it's probably coming through a little bit quiet on your computer, so we apologize for that. Hopefully, though, you can participate, and we do want you to know, if you're tuning in through live stream, that you're part of this. And so you guys know there's rules in place right now for groups greater than 50 people, and so we've got some folks here physically tonight, so glad for that. But for you guys tuning in on the live stream, we haven't forgotten about you. And many of you graciously volunteered to not be here for the sake of other people being here, or even for the sake of other people that you're connected to who maybe have a compromised immune system or whatever else. And so just know that you guys are part of what's happening here tonight. And so excited to worship again together. This is actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later tonight, but this is where Canvas really got started. Way back in 2017, and we didn't even get here till 2018. And when Sarah and I got here, there was a group meeting in this ballroom, and I'll share a little bit of that story later on. But super excited to be in this place again and worshiping. As you know, the Monterey Center, where we normally meet, is closed until September. And so we're grateful that we had another option. Space to rent in Victoria for group gatherings is not always an easy thing to find. And so we really see tonight as God's answer to prayer. And many have asked, are we opening back up? Are we going to keep doing this? There's nothing else on the calendar yet. And so this is like a trial run. So you guys, we're all the guinea pigs here tonight to see how this goes with some of these new things in place. And then we'll let you know when we decide to put another one on the calendar. And so excited to worship together. I'm going to turn over to Jake. Let me see if I have anything else. For the live stream, for those kids out there, I've been doing fun socks because this is the first time I will have preached wearing shoes since March. It's sort of weird. We've been live streaming from our living room, and so it's kind of weird. But for the kids out there, still wearing the funky socks. And today I've got a wrestler. I don't know if you can see. This is Lex Luger. A few weeks ago, I told his story, and one of you graciously found socks with him on them. And I got those in the mail earlier this week, and I'm like, I'm going to rock those on Sunday. So got shoes on, but also the fun socks. So Jake, excited to have these guys with us to lead in worship. And I'm going to turn over to you, and we'll get started.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. I've missed this. Oh, man. It's so nice. And, sorry. Junior was waving at me, and I wasn't sure if that meant that he needed something was wrong. We're good. Oh man, so it's been a hectic afternoon. I'll just put it that way. It's one of those things where it's like you're in a new place, you don't know exactly how everything works, and setting up everything was just really hectic. So I'd like to take a moment just to kind of slow down a little bit, and let's just take a minute to center our hearts and our minds just on God and on worship. Before we keep going though, I should mention part of the COVID guidelines, and this is really, really unfortunate because this is something that, it's kind of sad because we're all here together. But one of the biggest risks with gathering in large groups and spreading the infection is actually singing. And so what we need to be able to do, just in terms of making sure that we're protecting each other, and this is really, really sad, but we were not able to sing together tonight. So really I encourage you to just listen, read along with the words, and worship in your heart. There's a lot of really great, good truth that are in these songs. And so just let your heart and your mind connect to them just by through meditation tonight, just so that we can again just help keep each other safe in this time. So let's just take a minute, just silently in prayer. Let's just slow ourselves down, and we'll begin to worship here tonight. So Father God, we come before you right now. We enter your throne room, and even though we may not be able to worship exactly in the way that we want to, that doesn't limit us. It doesn't limit your goodness. It doesn't limit how worthy you are. So I pray, Father God, that just through our thoughts, through our contemplation, you would change us through these words. We would give glory to you through them. Lord, you are good. We love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think we can still stand. If you want to stand, if you're able to stand, feel free to stand. Otherwise, just feel free to stay seated.
Worship our King, and come let us bow at His
created to bury it alone. I hear your invitation to let it all go, and I see it now, laying it down. I know that I need you. I run to the Father, I fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason, no way. My heart needs a surgeon, my soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again and again and again. Oh, oh, you saw my condition, I fled from the storm. Your Son for redemption, the price for my heart. I don't have a context for that kind of love. I don't understand, can't comprehend. All I know is I need you. I run to the Father, fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason, no way. My heart needs a surgeon, my soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again and again and again. Oh, 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 again and again. Oh, my heart has been in your sight long before my first breath. Running into your arms is running to life from death. And I feel this rush deep in my chest. Your mercy is calling out, just as I am. You crowned with thorns, is crowned with glory now. The Savior knelt to wash our feet. Now at His feet we bow. The one who wore our sin and shame, now robed in majesty. The radiance of perfect love now shines for all to see. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Resurrected King is resurrected now. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. you are good, and you are present in this place. So we thank you that we get to experience your presence regardless of our situation, regardless of our circumstances, regardless of our location. You are here, you are present, and you are at work in our lives, Lord. So I pray as we just continue on tonight that our hearts and our minds will just be open to receive what you have for us. Lord, we just thank you just for the gift of your presence, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah, you can take a seat.
All right. Well, I sing much better in my head anyways, right? So, and thank you guys for being flexible. I feel like a little bit like I'm about to deliver a lecture to a surgeon's convention, but that's all right. Masks are okay. So we've been spending some time at the beach because we've got 3 little boys, and if we don't get outside already, there ain't no way we're getting our damage deposit back on our rental. But if we don't get the boys outside, like it's not good. And so these guys, they love Willows Beach. So we live real close to there, and of course careful to keep the appropriate distance and everything. But our little family unit will be going to the beach. And it's just been nice to be able to get out into the sunshine. And I know there's been moments, especially early on, when it's like stay quarantined in your house as much as you can. And we're just so grateful to be able to get some fresh air with the boys. And we were this was probably several weeks ago now, and we're hanging out at the beach. And we're sitting there, and we've got like our little family camp over there set up. And this little girl, about the same age, I think maybe in between Everett and Luca, just comes running into our camp. And she just kind of, flounces in there, sort of flirts with the boys for a minute, and then like runs off, like, come on, let's go play. And Everett, our 5-year-old, is sitting there, and he's got his stuffed dog with him. And he just sort of sits there and processes for a minute. And then he looks down at his dog and he says, and Sarah caught all, was listening to all this, looks at his dog and says, "Dog, one day I'm going to marry that girl." And it's like, dude, love at first sight on Willows Beach. Who said C-19 has been all bad, right? It's like, and so they go off and they start playing, they're running around and they're splashing and stuff. Well, at some point, I guess the little girl like splashed some water at Everett and got him in the face or something, and he comes trudging back to the camp, and comes back and informs us all that I am definitely not marrying Ruth. We're like, this is an important lesson, son. The game of love, you win some, you lose some. It can, love hurts, brother. This is a teaching moment for you, son. But we all love a good love story. And we're going to look at one in the Bible tonight, and it shows a lot of things. But I think it shows that God can bring a beautiful story out of a difficult situation. And there's a lot of messages that come through the story we're going to look at, but one that just comes through loud and clear is God can take a difficult situation and He can bring a beautiful story out of that. He can take a mess and He can bring something out of that is beautiful. The book of Judges. We covered the book of Judges last week on the live stream. And we've been, when people ask me, so what are you preaching at on your church these days? I'm like, I'm preaching the Bible. Like the whole Bible. I tell them, back in January, we started in Genesis, and we're just like hitting those big narrative movements to get us to the New Testament, because sometimes you can focus on who Jesus is, and that's good. But Jesus himself said, I fulfill all of the law and the prophets, all that came before me in the Old Testament. I'm the fulfillment of that. And so I think if we want to really understand who Jesus is, what he taught, what he did, we have to look at at the prequels, right? Sarah and I. She had never seen the Star Wars movies, and I married her anyways because she has so many other good qualities. But finally, we just celebrated our 7-year anniversary, and part of how we have been celebrating that is on Disney Plus. We are going through all of the Star Wars movies. And so we started with the original trilogy. I was like, you've never seen the original trilogy, we got to start there. And then we went to the prequels, and as an original trilogy person, not a big fan of the prequels, but we go to the prequels, and Sarah's loving it. I'm like, no, real Star Wars people don't love the prequels. They love the originals, and they hate the prequels. And she's like, no, this is so good because it makes so much more sense of the originals. Like when you go to that story, it helps put this story in better perspective. And so that's what we're, what'd you say? Yeah, so, and you know what? I found myself kind of, this is the first time I've admitted this in public. I found myself sort of enjoying them. Mostly because Everett is Anakin Skywalker in the first one. The cute little boy, I was like, oh man, he looks and sounds and acts and talks just like our little Everett, so now I have to like it because I keep seeing my little boy there. I'm like, Everett, I hope you don't have the same fate as that Anakin. But we're walking through the Old Testament to get a better understanding of who is Jesus and what came before him, what led to him and what he did. And so the book of Judges we covered last week, and it's a violent time. It's a bad time. The book of Judges is just cycle after cycle of the people falling into sin, violence, horror. It's not for kids, right? It's the kind of book you're like, you got to be a certain age to read through the book of Judges because it's violent. And there's some horrible things that it records, and God would raise up a judge, and he would help the people to come back together to follow God. And then as soon as the judge would die, the people would fall back into their old ways. And in the midst of that history, so while Judges is going on, the book of Ruth happens. Probably in sort of the second half of the book of Judges, that time frame. And so you look at all of what's happening on a big scale in the book of Judges, and then the book of Ruth sort of zeroes in on one family. It says, let's take a look at one family during this time. And so I want to take you to the book of Ruth tonight. And we're not going to read every verse in the book of Ruth, but we're going to cover the whole book of Ruth. Because it's really sort of a short story, right? It tells the story of this one family, one part of their story. And so in Ruth chapter 1, the book starts off like this. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Like it wasn't bad enough, right? This was their version of 2020, right? It's like things are going bad already, and now there's a famine. It's like, so a famine hits the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. And he and his wife and his 2 sons, so his 2 sons and his wife go with him. It says the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. So they're from Bethlehem, which, of course, Bethlehem, you hear a lot about at Christmas. There's some other people from Bethlehem that are famous. That's where these guys are from. They were in the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And these took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So this isn't a great time for Naomi. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law are now both widows in a time of famine. So this is not a good situation. To be a widow in that culture was already difficult, especially if you didn't have family around you to take care of you. And of course they don't, right? They're in a foreign land. They're in Moab, but they're from Bethlehem. And so all of a sudden, not only does Naomi lose her husband, but she loses her 2 son-in-laws too. So in that culture, the men were the ones who would have had the social standing to help take care of their wives. And now, in a matter of 10 years, all of that is wiped out. She's in an impossible situation, and so she insists on her 2 daughters-in-law. Remember, they're from Moab. She says, you guys go back to your family, and I'm going to go back to where I'm from. She insists that they remain here in their homeland. And you actually see 3 different responses. And here's the truth, is that when hard times befall us, there's a number of responses we can have, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not that we all respond the same way every time hardship comes to us. There's actually choices in how we will respond when we face these things. And so let's look at the responses. First is Orpah. So this is the one daughter-in-law. This isn't Ruth. This is her sister-in-law. She listens to her mother-in-law and returns to her people. And actually, Ruth 1 verse 15 indicates that she also goes back to her gods. And so Naomi says, go back to your land, and Orpah does. But she doesn't just go back to her land and to her people, but she goes back to her gods. The Moabites worshipped several gods, but the primary one was a god named Chemosh. This religion was erotic and violent. It was very different from the religion of the Israelites. In fact, throughout history, oftentimes the Israelites would get turned away and drawn aside by the Moabite religion, and oftentimes they would have to be pulled back. Right? This was not there were a lot of not nice things that happened in this religion, and so Orpah goes back. She goes back to what she came out of. It's interesting that there's certain things in our lives that can bring out this response. Sometimes it's good to go back. We feel like we want to go back to at least what's familiar or what's comfortable for us. And even with us right now, a lot of people have been asking, when are we gonna get back to the way that it was? And let me just challenge you guys. There is no going back to the way that it was. And yet that's our default, right? As humans, we want to go back to what we know, what's familiar, what's comfortable. Guys, this COVID thing has changed things. And so, doesn't necessarily mean that all the restrictions are going to be here forever. But what it does mean is that things are changing. And it's a natural impulse for us to resist that and to want to fall back into, I just want to get back to the way things were. And sometimes when hard times come in our lives, it can really shake us up and can really shake up what we believe. Orpah, we assume, married into the faith of her Israelite husband and family, and now is rejecting that. There's a man named Bart Ehrman. You can throw his picture up there. He's a professor in North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and he's pretty famous for falling away from the religion of his youth. And he's made really a career out of trying to convince Bible-believing Christians to reject their faith. And he's written several books about this. I've read several of his books where he just criticizes the Bible and he criticizes the faith, and sort of his goal is to try and wake Christians up to reject the faith that he was once in, that he now rejects. But it's fascinating because he's a Bible scholar. He studied the New Testament. Most of his books are about, these are the issues with the text of the Bible, any sort of textual criticism. But this is what he says about his loss of faith. He says, "The problem of suffering has haunted me for a very long time. It was what made me begin to think about religion when I was young, and it was what led me to question my faith when I was older. Ultimately, it was the reason I lost my faith." So maybe similar to Orpah. Hard times either hit his life or he observed hard times hitting other people's lives, and that was the trigger for him to say, farewell to my belief. I'm going to move into, he would claim now to be an agnostic. He would say the question of is there a God is not answerable. We just can't know. So he wouldn't call himself an atheist, but he certainly would say I've left Christianity behind. And so that's Orpah's response. Well, Naomi's response is a little bit different, but listen to what she says. So they get back to Bethlehem, and they come back into town. Now, Bethlehem was never a big town. And so probably at this time, Bethlehem's probably no bigger than about 200 people. And so everybody knows Naomi. She's been gone for a while. She's been gone at least 10 years. And she comes back, and they're all like, Naomi. So it's sort of like we were doing tonight. Like, it's been not 10 years, but it feels like 10 years. It's like, it's so good to see you. And that's what they do to Naomi. But listen to what she says in chapter 19. It says, so the two of them, this is Ruth and Naomi. We're gonna go backwards in just a minute to look at Ruth's statement. But the two of them go back to Bethlehem. It says they went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So the name Naomi means pleasant. Any guess what the name Mara means? Bitter. Bitterness. She says, "Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant anymore. Call me bitter, because God has done these horrible things in my life." So her faith remains. She's not an atheist, right? Her faith is still there to some degree, but it's lost its joy, because hard times can harden our hearts, right? We may hold on to our belief, and C.S. Lewis famously said this is when he lost his wife. His wife died not all that long after they were married, and he said, "What I'm really fearful of is not that I would somehow lose my belief in God, that he would somehow cease to exist." He says, "What I'm fearful of is that God is not who I thought he was. Like, I hold on to my faith, but I'm worried that maybe this God that I thought was a God of love is not a God of love after all, because of what I have come to experience through him." And you see something similar happening with Naomi. And when things seem uncertain, it can be very easy to go backwards, right? And Naomi's going back to her hometown, which isn't necessarily a step backwards, except she seems to be taking a step backwards in her faith. Have you ever felt this way? Like, has hard times ever hit you, and you're thinking like, man, I need to just back up a little bit. And you find yourself retreating back into maybe the person you used to be, or into things you used to do, or sort of gravitating to an identity you used to claim, and backing away from your faith. It's fascinating. I think this happens to the disciple Peter. If you're familiar with Peter, he's like the hardcore disciple of Jesus, ends up denying Jesus 3 times, is so hurt by that, it says he goes out into the night and weeps bitterly. This is a tough fisherman weeping bitterly because of what has happened. And when you find Peter again at the end of the book of John, what's he doing? He's fishing again. Jesus called him out of being a fisherman and says, "You're going to follow me, you're going to fish for people, you're going to invest in people." When he thinks that it's all over for him, he goes back to what he knows. He goes back to what's comfortable. He goes back to being a fisherman. That's natural for us to do. So she's heading back. And it's funny because this can, if we're not careful, this can set us back. Full of pop culture references tonight, but you may be familiar with the movie The Princess Bride. You can put, this is Princess Buttercup. And at the beginning of the movie, her boyfriend goes off and apparently dies at sea. And she's distraught over this, as any young lady would be, losing their boyfriend at sea. And she says this interesting statement. She says, "I will never love again." She's basing like what future Princess Buttercup is going to do on how present Princess Buttercup is feeling. And that's what I mean by we can go backwards. She's saying like, okay, so I had this great relationship, but then it ended badly, and so therefore I'm never going to put myself in that position again. So I'm going to go backwards to what I was before I ever even met this guy. And I'd rather be lonely. I'd rather be by myself. I'd rather close myself off from love than to love and to be hurt again. And you see something, I think, similar with Naomi. She still seems to have a faith, but she says, "Don't call me pleasant. Call me by a different name." Of course, names were very significant in this culture. You matched your life up with your name. That's why you had to be careful of what you named your kids, because names were so important that you would try to live up to what your name said. And so that's Naomi's response. What about Ruth? There is a third way. Ruth in chapter 1, verse 16. So this is before they go back to Bethlehem. This is what Ruth says. Now, Naomi's saying, "Go back to your people and to your gods." She says, and she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods." So laying on some peer pressure. It says, "Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge." This is significant. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. She's a Moabite, right? She has a different people. She has a different God. She's saying, but I'm going to follow you, Naomi. and I'm going to become part of your people, and I'm going to begin to worship and follow your God. She says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so. So now she's calling him the Lord. At first it's generic, your God, will be your God will be my God. Now she's naming the God. She says, and may the Lord, may Yahweh do so to me and more, if anything but death parts me from you. So now she's placing herself even under the authority of Naomi's God. And she's saying, I'm going to go where you go. Ruth shows great loyalty to Naomi and acceptance of the Israelites' God. I can't help myself. Here's one. This is the last pop culture reference. This is also the last Star Wars reference, I promise. This is what I think of when I read this, right? Luke, spoiler alert, loses his aunt and uncle. They're looking for the droids that he has. They go, they burn the place down. They kill the only family that he thinks he has. And he goes to Obi-Wan, and he says, there's nothing for me here now. He says, I want to go with you. I want to learn to be a Jedi. I want to learn about the Force. I want to learn to be a Jedi like my father. And so he goes with Obi-Wan, and he says, there's nothing for me here now. My future lays ahead. And I always loved that. And I love that character in Luke. He's saying, things are really bad right now. But rather than stay here and just kind of wallow in my misery, I think there's something more. I'm going to keep moving forward. Like, I'm going to keep going. Obi-Wan, I don't have the slightest clue of what it means to be a Jedi, but I'm going to follow you so that you can teach me how to do that. I'm going to follow you. Teach me your religion. Teach me the ways of the Force like you know, so that I can become a Jedi. Ruth is saying, like, there's nothing for me here now. I'm going to go with you, Naomi, and your God will be my God. Like, as I go with you, my life is going to move forward into something different. You know, psychologists are more and more confirming something that they call post-traumatic growth. Where essentially if you experience difficult times in your life, it really shows you what your character is like. And oftentimes we don't raise to the challenge unless there's a challenge there. And sometimes what happens is because we get hit by difficult circumstances, we actually can surprise ourselves sometimes, and we can rise to the challenge. But if that challenge never came, we would never see that we actually had the ability to become and to be far more than we thought we could. And they did some tests with this, and you know what they found helps to experience this post-traumatic growth is to understand your circumstances as part of your life story. So if your hard times remain in the abstract and you're just like, this horrible thing happened to me and I can't make any sense of it, chances are you're never going to really move past that. But what they found is that if you can somehow place that within your life story, you can say, however you do that, this happened for a reason, God allowed this to happen so I could become stronger. I mean, like, it doesn't even so much matter if it's true what you come up with, but if you put it into your life story, they found that those were the people who could move on. And what they did is they basically put them in front of a blank sheet of paper and said, just start writing. Like, just write. Don't worry about grammar. Like, just write. Write your life story and try to make sense of what has happened to you. And they just kept writing until somehow their experience got swallowed up into their life myth, right? Their life story. And they actually found that up to a year later, the people who were able to do that actually had physical benefits. They got sick less than the people who couldn't do that, the people who gave up, who said, I just can't make sense of this. And so it's interesting that making sense of what's happening in your life as part of a bigger story, psychologists are even finding now, like, you know what? There's something to that. And I get the sense that that's a little bit of what Ruth is doing. Like, she lost her husband too, right? It's not just Naomi who's suffering. Ruth has lost her husband, and yet she's choosing to move forward. And God is at work, even when we can't see all the ways that he is at work. Ruth does what she knows to do until she knows what to do, right? That's a phrase I heard somebody tell me one time, and I was like, I like that. Sometimes you don't know what to do, so do what you know to do. Like, get up, brush your teeth, right? Like, okay, I know I got to do these things. I know I got to eat. Like, and what you find in the life of Ruth is that that's what she does. She just keeps moving forward. So they moved to Bethlehem, and there's actually laws. I don't know if any of you guys enjoy reading the book of Leviticus. It's one of the books in the Bible with all the laws, and sometimes people are like, why is that even in the Bible? Like it's super boring. Why do we read through that? Well, because it helps make sense of things. So Ruth goes to Bethlehem. She's a foreigner, right? And she's poor. And so she shows up. She can't get a job. She's got no family. So she goes there and she starts gleaning the fields. She goes to the fields, and the rules, as laid out in Leviticus, says that for the Israelites, when you glean your fields, when you harvest, you're supposed to leave the edges of your field so that foreigners and poor people could come and they could benefit from your field. And it says when you drop things, like as you're harvesting and you're dropping stuff along the way, it says don't pick that up. Leave that for those who need it. And so that's exactly what Ruth does. She does what she knows to do until she knows what to do. She shows up. She's like, okay, according to your people's laws, Naomi, like we should be able to get some barley harvest if I go to these fields and work hard for it. And so that's what she does, and that's what happens. She goes and she gets some food. Well, it just so happened that this field is owned by a man named Boaz, who is a relative of Naomi's family. And so she gets to know Boaz as the leader of this owner of this field, and he treats her kindly and says, look, like take more than what you need. And he starts telling his workers, like, hey, like leave a little extra for her, like and starts treating her with kindness. Well, there's some more laws laid out in the boring parts of the Old Testament that says, look, if you lose everything because you're poor and you got to sell all your land off just to survive, if another relative of yours, your closest male relative, can actually come in and buy back those things that you lost, those things that you had to sell. And so they find out that Boaz is a relative of their family. And so Boaz, and we're not sure how distant or what his relation is, but basically Boaz can become this person. He can buy back all that, because likely when all the men died, they had to sell everything to move back. And saying, no, Boaz can do this. He's what's known as, in the Hebrew, it's a goel. But it means like a kinsman redeemer. Someone in your family that can redeem back those things that you lost. And so they have harvest time. They harvest the barley. And there's a picture here of, this is a threshing floor of sort of what it might have looked like. And so you would put all your barley or whatever it is that you had on there, and you could either have the animals walk around on it, or you would like beat it with a stick to separate, the chaff and everything. And then what you would do is you would throw it up in like a basket or something, and the wind would take away the chaff, and all the good stuff would fall down. So you could have your stuff. So Boaz does that with his harvest. And likely a lot of people used this, and so you would do that, and then you would pile up all your crop. But back then, right, you don't have security systems or whatever, so you would sleep out there with your crop, so that you could get an early start the next morning, but also so you could beat off anybody who came to steal your food. So that's what Boaz does, and he's sleeping by his crop. And Naomi does something really bold, and she actually goes to him at night. And she uncovers his feet, because if you're married and you know that if your wife has ever like pulled the blankets off your feet or something, you wake up pretty quick. You're like, why is it freezing in here? I don't know if you guys have that, but that's what she does. She lifts the blanket off his feet. He wakes up and realizes that this woman that he met just recently is like, down there by his feet. And essentially what Ruth does is asks him to become her redeemer. Because not only could the Redeemer buy back the property that they lost, but he could marry the woman who lost her husband. And so she gives him this marriage proposal, which of course in that day and age as well was incredibly bold, but she does. And she essentially says, you are a redeemer, part of our greater family. You can be a redeemer for me. Would you be that for me? And the author of Ruth, we're not sure who it is, but they're so good because they build the tension. And Boaz says, I'm actually not the closest relative to be able to do that. Like, there's someone else in town that if they decide to do this, then I can't be that guy. And so Boaz, being this man of honor, the very next morning finds this guy at the city gate. Of course, the city gate is where a lot of transactions and things would happen. That was sort of a high traffic area. You'd have a lot of witnesses there because everyone's going in and out of there. And so Boaz finds this guy. We don't know who he is. He's never named. But he finds this guy and essentially says, if you want to do this, then I will it's your right to do this. But if you don't, then I will do this. And the guy says, at first he says, yeah, and then he realizes, oh, and I also have to marry Ruth. It's like, I'm not ready for that sort of commitment, and passes it on to Boaz, and Boaz becomes Ruth's redeemer. And it's this beautiful story of Ruth having lost everything, and yet the story plays out in this amazing way. And so right at the end of the book, chapter 4, verse 13, it says, so Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, and he went to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed by the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and made his name be renowned in Israel. So Naomi's sort of benefiting from all these things that Ruth is benefiting from. Now Boaz will also take care of her. It says, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And of course, obviously, it's Ruth's son, but she becomes the grandma. It says, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so if you were an Israelite at this time and you read that, you would go, whoa, King David. King David comes from this line. Well, who comes from King David's line? Jesus. So Ruth gets grafted in, redeemed into the lineage of King David and ultimately of Jesus. Talk about taking a bad situation and turning it around. The author lets the readers know what seemed like a hopeless situation actually led to Israel's greatest king. And of course, now us, looking back, know that it even led to Jesus. Look at what God can do with a hopeless situation. And so what does this account teach us about God? It teaches us that God is always at work writing a bigger story than we know. How does this relate to Jesus? Well, for one, it leads to his birth. But also, as beautiful as Ruth and Boaz's story is, it would never be perfect because their own sin would always stand in the way of their relationship with God. They both needed redemption. Ruth needed a redemption in one way, but they both needed spiritual redemption. Well, Jesus, who comes from their line, actually brings that to them. The New Testament refers to the church as the bride of Christ. It talks about how Jesus redeemed us out of our hopeless situation of sin to become the church, to become this bride, this beautiful metaphor that we become. 1 John 4:19 says, we love because he first loved us. He came to us and he draws us into a much bigger story. What time is it? I want to make sure, see how much time I have to tell you this story. Let me make this one a little briefer. But Sarah and I, we see some cool parallels of our story in the Ruth story. This was the first weekend that we were dating. So 2012 or 13? 12. We're married in 13. So just briefly, it's a longer story, but here's the Coles Notes version. In 2010, I moved to the Atlanta area to get on staff at a church. And I was the young adult pastor, and so I was only 25 at the time, and so many of the people that I was the pastor for, we were the same age. And so it was one of those things, I was single, and I just made this, like when I first got there, I'm like, you know what? I'm not gonna be that guy who's like dating all these people in his church. Like I'm just not gonna do that. And so I basically prayed this prayer and said, God, you know that I'd like to be married one day, but I also want to be wise in how I conduct myself as a pastor. And so I'm just gonna sort of just back off, and unless I know that you're leading me to fully commit to somebody, then I'm just not gonna go. I'm just gonna trust you with it. I'm gonna do what I know to do until I know what to do. I'm going to be faithful to what you've called me to do as a pastor. And would you fill in these details? Well, meanwhile, I didn't realize at the time, I didn't know Sarah at the time, but she was coming out of a pretty difficult situation. She had just lost her boyfriend, her job, and the place where she was living. And so all of a sudden she's got this blank slate in her life and realizing, God, like, what's my next steps? She had trained to be a teacher, and so she applied to probably 10 different schools and just kept getting no. There was a freeze on hiring at the time because there was all this turmoil in the school system, and they're like, we would love to hire you, but we're not hiring anybody at this time. And so she goes to a mentor of hers, a sweet lady, much like Naomi would have been to Ruth. And this mentor says, well, I was a teacher for 30 years in this school district. Let me put a cover letter together for you, and let me see if I can help you. And she does, and sure enough, Sarah gets an interview. They say, well, the only thing that we have open is to teach 5th grade. And Sarah said, I've never even spent time in a 5th grade classroom. Like, that's not what I was trained to do, but they gave her the job anyway. She says, I'm a fast learner, and I'm a hard worker. And so they hired her, and all of a sudden, Sarah moves to Jonesboro, the city where I am. Well, she moves there, doesn't have a church, and so her friend says, why don't you come to church with me? And they come to our church. Well, of course, the lady's excited because she knows there's this eligible bachelor. And she says, have you met Spiky Mikey yet? And she's like, well, no, but I keep hearing about him. All the grandmas in the church are telling me about this Spiky Mikey. Who is this guy? And she soon found out when she walked into my Sunday school class. And I was about to teach, and it's like, oh, I see we have a new student today. And noticed her right off the bat. We sort of became friends, but she was kind of working hard at school. I was doing my thing, and really we would say that God sort of hid us from each other until the time was right. And we remember when that time was, where we're out for lunch with some of the other people in our church, and we weren't even sitting by each other. She was kind of over there talking to people there. I'm over here, and it's like all of a sudden the light bulb went on. It was like, what am I doing? like, why have I not, like she could possibly, and so I'm sort of having this epiphany over here, and it's interesting because Sarah was on her own journey, and she was reading a book called The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller, and because she was thinking, like, I want to get married, but why do I want to get married? Like, what is marriage? Is this just the next step in my life, in moving through life, or is this, like, have meaning for me? And so while she's reading this book, God just, in the quietness of her own heart, speaks to her and says, don't worry about it. By Easter, your season of singleness will be over. And so she just kind of logs that away, like, that's interesting, and holds on to that and kind of forgets about it, but writes it down, and it's there, this promise she believes she got from God. Well, months and months go by. Eventually, I noticed her, and now I got to try and figure out how to get her to notice me. And my brother and I had just published a book, and so I had tried everything I could to, like, get her attention. I'm like, all right, I'm going to resort to this. I'm going to resort to, like, name dropping myself. I'm be like, I know this published author, and would love to give you the book if you want. And no joke, she said something along the lines of, I've got a long list of books that I want to read, but yours isn't on it. I was sort of like, okay, yeah, woo. It was like, swing and a miss. And so I was like, that's all right, gotta keep trying. So I'm a Canadian boy living near Atlanta, Georgia, and so wintertime comes, and there's this skating rink that they set up. I'm just like, this is great. Like, nobody knows how to skate. I'm gonna look like Kurt Browning, I'm not the greatest skater either, but compared to them. And so we do this young adult, and so I'm totally planning young adult ministry, like excursions, just so that I can look good to Sarah. It's probably not the best intentions, but I'm like, hey guys, we should all go skating. They're like, we don't know how to skate. We don't even like skating. No, you'll love it. We should do this. And so we're there, and of course Sarah's there, and we so often all slide by, and we're sort of like trying to spinning around like, yeah, how are you doing? Don't think it's working, but eventually she took pity on me. And in the sketchy, dark back alley of where we were doing our young adult ministry at the time, after everybody else had gone, we talk in that parking lot, and we decide, we're both feeling that God is leading us together, and so we become officially boyfriend and girlfriend. That's a Thursday night. The next day was our first official date. We went for a jog. I hate running. That's how you know it was love. We go for a jog, and Sarah realizes it's Good Friday. This is Easter weekend. She's like, God told me at the beginning of months and months ago that my season of singleness would be over by Easter. And our first date is Good Friday. Obviously, we ended up getting married several months later. And over the course of our time in Jonesboro, ended up feeling a call like God was leading us to Victoria. And actually, July of 2017, I was standing about where you're sitting. I was standing right there. And it was a Sunday night service that they had been doing here to sort of get things going for Canvas Out Bay. And we're singing a song, and God speaks to my heart right there. And I know we're supposed to move to Victoria. There was a lot more to that story, but I was standing right there when it happened. So this room's always been special to us. And all of a sudden, Sarah and I are looking to go on another adventure. Like Ruth going to a foreign land, we're following God where he leads. You know, the point of the story is not how the story turns out, but who turns it out. Right? Because stories don't always end up like this happy ending. Like, oh, and they got married and they lived happily ever after. And that's not the point of Ruth, and that's not the point of our story. The point is God had a bigger story that he was going to tell if we have the faith to walk with him into it. And so let me ask you tonight, do you trust your Redeemer? Do you trust that he can take your life, maybe the brokenness, maybe the difficulties, and he can put it into a bigger story that is far greater than you ever saw coming? He did it for Ruth. He's doing it for us, and he can do that for you too. So I'm going to pray for us in a moment, and the band can come on up, and we're gonna close our time in a song together. But before I pray, before we do that, let me just give you a couple announcements as we head out. I encourage you guys. Unfortunately we can't really hang out in this room to talk because of keeping the distance. So once this is over, I encourage you guys to spill out onto the outdoor spaces and to keep that social distance, that physical distance, not social distance, right? We're still socializing. The physical distance apart. But before I let you know of a few things that are happening, I wanted to just recognize someone has a birthday today. And they would never in a million years want everybody to pay attention to them, but let's do it anyways. Jack Burnside, it's your birthday today. And it's 14? Big 14. So we can't sing, but in our hearts we're singing happy birthday to you. And maybe now that you're 14, you'll be able to beat your pastor in beanbag toss. Because at the church picnic, man, it came down to that one beanbag. And, well, you'll have to ask them how it turned out. But also coming up, again, next week we're going to be back to live streaming. We'll put out in the e-newsletter when we're going to gather together like this again. And so there's not one yet. So it's going to be live stream for now, but we'll put out in the e-news when we're going to do this again. And we'll just, if you're not part of the e-news, that's the best way to get the information as it comes out to stay up to date. And also because of trying to be wise about how many services and things that we touch as well, if you want to give, you can just continue to do that online, and so we won't be taking in giving tonight, but there's instructions on how to do that on the website if you feel God leading you to do that. And so let me turn it over to these guys, and it's good to go out. The words of this song, this is a good way to go out, and so we're going to sing together. Well, we're going to listen to them sing. Pay attention to the words. Pay attention to the words of this song. And then we're gonna have to move out of this room. But so good to see you guys. So good to do this again. So let me pray, and then I'll turn it over to these guys. God, we're thankful. We're so thankful that when you look at our lives, you don't see just what is, but you see the potential of what could be. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that for us when we come up against hardships, when we face difficult days. We can lose sight. We can become very short-sighted. and we can focus on just what's in front of us. But God, we know that you can take a mess and turn it into a beautiful story. And so we ask that you would do that in our lives. Would we trust you as our Redeemer? Now that we follow you, God, would you lead us into the story you desire to tell with our lives? And as you did with Ruth's story, may our story bless many people outside of our own lives. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yeah, so this song is kind of a benediction and a blessing. The song is called The Blessing, so it's appropriate. But really just, take these next couple minutes as we're singing this to just receive this blessing. And let's go from here just, in the spirit of joy and gratitude.
Lord,
each other in this community. I pray that you would continue to protect us,